It's not a cursory report. It has exact times. It has information on the movement of switches, on the movement of throttles, on the condition of the aircraft, on whether it had been maintained, on cockpit conversations. And for the benefit of our viewers, here's what it boils down to. Remember, Air India 171, a flight between Ahmedabad to London Gatwick, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner aircraft on the 12th of June, exactly a month back, shortly after takeoff, crashed outside the perimeter wall of Ahmedabad Airport within 35 seconds of taking off. 260 people in total, including people on the ground and people in the air, lost their lives in one of the worst crashes in the history of Indian aviation. There was one person who miraculously survived. At the moment, at 1:20 approximately a.m., the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau of India, which is the nodal agency conducting the investigation, has posted its report. We were able to get hold of that report and we were able to go through it. And the essential point for our viewers, in case you're just joining in, and there'll be a million questions asked of this, but in terms of the sequence of events, shortly after taking off at a speed of approximately 180 knots, and within 1 second of each other, both the fuel control switches on the Boeing 787 went from on to off. Shortly thereafter, one of the pilots asked the other, "Why did you do that?" To which the second pilot says, "I didn't." At that stage, the pilots moved to fighting to get the engines back on, because if the fuel switches have been switched off, then the engines are starved of fuel. They are essentially switched off and they stop thrusting or developing thrust, which you require right after you take off to ensure that the aircraft flies out. What is important to know is that the engines did develop thrust. One of the engines did restart. Remember, the 787 is designed to be able to fly out in a single engine. As I understand it, perhaps the second engine did have a successful restart as well, but it didn't start thrusting properly or enough. In fact, none of the two engines did, which is why, as the footage indicated, the Boeing 787, it took off and then it appeared to slowly go down because the engines just weren't thrusting enough and it crashed. There was a mayday call. That's already been released earlier on.
Right.
The air traffic controller did respond, but by then it was too late. Aditi, if this aircraft had a few thousand feet more of altitude and a little bit more time and a little bit more speed, they would have gotten out of this. Aditi, one of the points that everybody had speculated on the basis of that footage which we see on our screen of the plane taking off, was whether the flap configuration on the wings was correct. So if you've got the wings of the aircraft, there are certain surfaces, which are the flaps. They have to be in the takeoff position. They're right underneath, right, like this. Instead of this, they are like this in a takeoff configuration on both sides. Obviously, if the aircraft is not configured properly in terms of its flap position, its takeoff flap position, then taking off becomes much more difficult. This digital flight data recorded information says that, number one, the aircraft was properly configured for takeoff. The flap position was okay. So that theory is thrown out, doesn't apply. The undercarriage was in the retracted position. It hadn't been in the raised position. But, in a situation like that, when you're just seconds off the ground and you are in a crisis, the pilots may not have had enough time to lift the undercarriage. In other words, to make the aircraft more aerodynamic. Even if they did, if the fuel flow to the engines was cut off, as we know now that it was, then, it wouldn't have gone up necessarily. So that's something fairly, it's consequential in the overall outcome, but in the scenario that they were in, the undercarriage not being retracted is something that could be understood.
Absolutely. And Vishnu,
it all boils down to, and this is my final sentence, Aditi.
Right.
It all boils down to why were the fuel switches, why did they move from on to off shortly after takeoff. Nobody knows that. Was there an electrical failure? When one pilot asked the other, did you do that? He says, no, I didn't. And then they switched on the engines again. The engine started working, but it was too late. It's a huge mystery.